It's a less conventional way of boarding a ship, but it works. They didn't spot me coming in through the forward torpedo tubes. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to USS Cod. Let's see what I've got in here.
And indeed, ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard USS Cod. Today, we're going to take a look through some of the highlight features aboard the submarine. Obviously not everything, because go and see it yourself to see everything possible. But there are a few unique things that you can see aboard Cod, and I'm going to try and cover some of those in particular today. So, starting off with my point of entry, the forward torpedo room. One of the things that you might have been wondering over the years is how exactly do they make sure that the complicated procedure of flooding the tube, opening the outer doors, not opening the inner doors, launching the torpedo, closing the outer doors, etc., all goes on without somebody getting some stage of the operation wrong and ending up with the submarine being flooded or the torpedo being launched before everything is ready? Well, part of those controls can be seen here atop torpedo tube number 2. And as you can see, everything's in nice big metal levers, so it's pretty much impossible to get it wrong because they're all nice and etched and labelled as well. So starting with the one on the far left, you can see there indicators for the breech door or the muzzle door being unlocked. And as long as that system is working, you can't have both, which means that in theory, you shouldn't be able to open the outer door and the loading door at the same time and thus flood the sub. Then above that, you've got an indicator showing the muzzle door and how much it's open by. So currently, of course, it's set to 0 degrees because the muzzle door is closed, but as the door opens, it'll show you 30 degrees, 60 degrees, up to 90 degrees, which of course is when you can launch the torpedo, because just because the door is unlocked and opened doesn't mean you want to launch the torpedo just yet, because if it's only partway open, bad things are going to happen to you. And then running down the side, you've got 2 more indicator levers. The first one, which is kind of in the middle of the picture, is currently set to muzzle door closed, but when lifted, the drain valve is locked, which of course prevents the incoming seawater from being constantly drained out of the torpedo tube and flooding the rest of the sub, or at least the parts where water that might otherwise intrude into the tube is taken away. And the one further on is currently set to muzzle door unlocked, but when it's turned all the way up, the tube is ready to fire. And, of course, that will then signal to the command crew that they can launch torpedo from this tube. But what about the torpedo when it's in the tube? How do you set the torpedo? What speed do you set it at? How deep do you want it to run? Do you want it to turn once it's been launched? And you might think, well, surely you could do that before you stick the torpedo in the tube. On paper, in theory, yes, you could. However, there are a couple of problems with that. Firstly, it means messing with the torpedo in the relatively cramped and confined environment of the forward torpedo room with hand tools, and secondly, the submarine deploys with torpedoes in the tubes to maximize the number of torpedoes that are being carried, and even if you've launched those, you are going to be reloading those tubes if you've hit your target the first time or you've withdrawn later on in a calm period. Or if you're in combat, you're going to be shoving a new set of torps in there as soon as possible. You don't have time to be sitting around and fiddling with them. So, in actual fact, changing the settings on the torpedoes happens while they're in the tube. And you can see here a light has been set up inside the tube, and you can see these little pokey bits sticking out the bottom left and the top of the tube. These are how you adjust those settings. But which ones are which? Well, let's find out now. So now we're inside the tube, you can see there is a device at roughly the 8 o'clock position, one at the 12 o'clock position, and one at about the 2 o'clock position, which has just withdrawn itself. And each of these is deployed and actuated from outside the tube and then pulled back into the body of the tube to allow the torpedo to be released. So if we start with the one on the bottom left at roughly the 8 o'clock position, this is the gyro setter. So, among other things, this is what will tell the torpedo if it just needs to run straight or if it needs to run a certain distance and then turn. And then if you look to the 12 o'clock position, you'll see a little pin which is just about to pop up for you. There it goes. That is depth setting, so obviously deep if you're going after a big target, shallow if you're going after a small target. And at the 2 o'clock, the one that's going up and down, the little arrow-shaped one, that is the high and low speed setting for the torpedo. And obviously all of these would be set up for the specific target you're shooting at. So high speed, short range, shallow depth at a destroyer perhaps, lower speed, running deep, perhaps with a bit of an angle turn if you're firing against a carrier at distance. And then as you head back through this Gato-class submarine, one of the first things you'll come across after the torpedo room is officers' wardroom and quarters. And as you can see here, the modern-day crew of the Cod try to strike a nice balance between having it set up pretty much as if the World War II crew have just left the sub, but combined, as you can see there on the table, with photos and information showing the actual crew aboard the sub at various times. And often you can actually look at that and match up some of the details that they've recreated rather specifically. So, for example, here at the aft end of this same room, you can see we've got an old gramophone-record player, depending on what you want to call it, for the playing of vinyl records, but you've also got a radio system. And on the radio system, they've actually got a rather nice recreation of some of Tokyo Rose's broadcasts, which would be something that Cod's crew could fairly regularly pick up when they were on deployment, because their operational area carried them well within range of the Japanese broadcast radio stations.
Hello to my orphans wandering the Pacific tonight. I have some lovely new music to serenade you lonely GIs and sailors, while your wives and girlfriends are out on dates with all those well-paid 4Fs back home. First on the platter is a dedication for the boys on the submarine Cod, sailing along the coast of Formosa. Enjoy this song, submariners. Tomorrow you may be sleeping on the bottom of the sea, far, far, far from your homes back in the States.
So you can see just what the Japanese were attempting to accomplish with the Tokyo Rose station. It mixed in, recent news and tunes and so forth from the US with a bunch of outright propaganda, but also some rather disturbing information, because they would, as you just saw in that excerpt, include things like references to specific submarines if they knew or suspected where those submarines were operating, which in theory was designed to make those crews think, oh no, they know exactly where we are, we're all about to die, which of course would affect morale. And of course you heard at the top of the broadcast various insinuations about what their loved ones might be getting up to while they were about to die in the middle of the Pacific. And so, for obvious reasons, Allied HQ it generally said you're not allowed to listen to it, but a good number of crews, including Cods, disregarded that, partly because, hey, it was broadcasting baseball results and the most recent music, so it was all good as far as they were concerned for that. And generally speaking, they were actually fairly resistant to the overall propaganda, because they understood, yes, this is Japanese propaganda, and if they do mention the sub and its activities accurately, then actually, technically speaking, this is somewhat helpful, because if they don't mention you, then they theoretically don't know where you are, which is good, because that means you can expect to sneak up on something fairly nice. And if they do mention that they know who you are and where you are, well, you've just given us a heads up that there might be some intense Japanese anti-submarine warfare in the area, or at least what passes for intense Japanese anti-submarine warfare, so we need to be on our guard. So thanks for that information, Tokyo Rose. Coming further back still, we have this rather innocuous-looking black box, which is just forward of the control room, but you might notice there's a voltmeter above it. And that's because this is a testing station for one of the sub's battery arrays. So each one of these individual holes connects to one of the ship's batteries, and when you plug this in, the voltmeter above gives you a voltage reading, so you can use this to check the charge level of all of the batteries. And of course, if all of them are roughly the same charge and one or two of them are a little bit off, then you know that perhaps something is wrong with those batteries and you need to go and investigate. And handily, if you do need to go and investigate, right below it is one of these things, which you'll see scattered all through the ship. And this is the internal communication system. As you can see, you've got your telephone unit there, so you pick up the handset, and on the right you can see you've got a dial, and that will connect you to another corresponding handset in a different portion of the ship. So this allows you to report all sorts of things, everything from, hey, this battery's at low voltage, I'm going to investigate it, all the way through to, hey, control room, I've had to close the hatchway here because everything forward is being flooded, and we're going to try and repair that. Or any number of other things. And of course, other people can communicate with you as well. So the engine room might say, hey, hang on a minute, we're supposed to be going at, let's say, 5 knots, and we're only getting power for 4 knots underwater. Can you check some of the batteries and see if we've got any voltage losses across any of them? And also around this area, just forward of the control room, is this little station. And as you might imagine looking at it, there's the fan, some depth gauges, another communication system up there on the top right. It is a little bit of an ad hoc installation. You can see the PPI scope there over on the right-hand side on the lower section. And yeah, this is because this is a sensor system that Cod was not originally designed with. But of course, over time, she was refitted with more and more advanced sonar and radar, and those needed control units, and there frankly just wasn't much more space in the control room or in the conning tower, and so additional control stations had to be implemented, such as this one, and, well, all this electronics would of course run relatively hot, hence the handy fan up to the top left to keep the operator from dying of heat stroke. But speaking of the control room...
Right, everybody, welcome to the control room aboard USS Cod. And in keeping with the fact, as we've already seen up front, that this sub is almost in a condition where you could just sail her away and everything's operational, that means, of course, all the alarms are also operational. So, various alarms that you might hear aboard a submarine, starting with the one you really don't want to hear. And for those of you who haven't been in the US sub before, that's collision, which is not a good thing. Something you would hear somewhat more regularly, however, especially in wartime, if I can get them to move. So that's general quarters. That means there's an enemy in sight, or there's possibly an enemy in sight, or of course if you're in a sub that might be on radar or on sonar. And then the one that you always hear in the movies, which is extremely loud, shockingly enough, that's the dive signal. So it has to be loud enough so everyone knows, yeah, we're now at diving stations. Probably not a brilliant idea to be left outside of the pressure hull when that goes off.
And just above the control room is the conning tower, which is now often called the sail in modern submarines, at least in some navies. But as you can probably imagine looking at this photo, given that over there on the left is part of the torpedo information system telling you which tubes are ready to launch, and over there on the right is a communications system, again for talking inside the boat, and that's the full width of this compartment. It ain't exactly particularly large. I mean, what you can see here in this photo, that's probably half the compartment. I'm stood right at the back with my back up against other instrumentation taking this photo on a fairly wide angle lens, and obviously there's the periscope in the middle. And because, once again, Cod is laid out as if it's about to sail off and go into action, you have the various ONI, or Office of Naval Intelligence, books laid out on the right-hand side, just below that handset. And here you can see an excerpt from one of those ONI books, and this is what I mean by ship recognition pictures. So you've probably seen a lot of the basic statistics pictures floating around the internet where you've got a top view and a side view. But this is what you would have for merchant vessels. As you can see, you've got a specific type of merchant vessel in this case, and what it looks like from a side on. But then you've also got what it looks like, or what a model of it looks like, from various viewing angles. So that then means if you pop your periscope up and you see an incoming ship from almost any angle, if you can match it, roughly speaking, to one of the various profile pictures across this particular angle, in the case of a merchant ship, then you know what it is without having to guess from purely a side or top-down view. Of course, from a sub, if you get a top-down view of an enemy ship, something's gone horribly, horribly wrong. But one of the really, really fancy things that's up here, which you don't get to see on most subs, and you certainly will not get to see working, is this. Now, what's this, you might think? Well, if you've been aboard various museum battleships and so forth, you might think this looks somewhat like some weird form of fire control computer, as seen in the various plotting rooms. And those of you who have consulted the diagrams, of course, already know what this is. This is, in fact, a Torpedo Data Computer, TDC Mark I, one of the most important bits of equipment aboard Cod and indeed aboard most US subs during the Second World War, because this is a mechanical fire control computer for the launching of torpedoes. So, like you have the forward fire control table, etc., on a battleship like USS New Jersey or Iowa or Massachusetts, and that will tell you where to point the guns and how to shoot them to hit a moving target. This does the same thing, but on a much smaller scale for the torpedoes aboard a submarine, again, based on how much information you can give it. And it calculates for both the fore and aft tubes, so it can give you a solution for the forward tubes or the aft tubes, depending on your relative bearing to the target and, of course, everybody's speed. But one of the even more exceptional things about Cod is not only does she have her torpedo data computer, which a few of the museums and or museum subs in the US do have, but Cod's still works and can be powered up. And as a result, the guys aboard Cod know a fair bit about it. And if you ask them really, really nicely, you might even be able to see it for yourself. Although, obviously, being 80 plus years old, the poor old thing doesn't get run very often because it's an original piece and subject to a fair bit of wear and tear. But that's why you can watch these videos. You can actually see it in operation and in explanation, even if you're unable to access the conning tower yourself for various reasons if you go and visit the sub. And so let's do that.
Right, so everyone, we're up in the conning tower. We've already seen a few of the other bits and pieces over in various elements of this very, very small space that sits on top of the main pressure hull. But this is the pièce de résistance. This is the thing that allows US submarines to become so effective once, the Mark 14s actually work for a change. This is the Torpedo Data Computer, or TDC. This one is a Mod 4, so there are slightly earlier ones. So, for example, this panel here, you wouldn't see on an earlier one, and this panel would essentially be just one big panel. So if you've seen pictures of a TDC that looks slightly different, it'll just be a slightly different make and model. But essentially, this is fire control, as you would have on the guns of a battleship or a cruiser, but this is for torpedoes, which means there's a few different elements compared to gun fire control. So, for example, and I'll hopefully be putting static photos closer up, because otherwise all you're going to see is the back of my head. So over here on our right, we have torpedo run, that's in thousands of yards, and the spread, so if you're firing multiple torpedoes, what angle are they going to go off at? You've got the gyro angle, because of course you might not have the bow pointed directly at the target, or you might not have the bow pointed directly in the direction the torpedo actually needs to go if you're doing deflection shooting, which you'll have to do if your target is actually mobile. So the gyro angle will set what direction your torpedo is going to turn after it leaves the tube, and you then have correct solution. So this will tell you, okay, the system thinks it's actually done all the calculations and it's ready to go. And as you'll see with most of the stuff here, everything is split. So on the left-hand side here, you've got the aft tubes. On the right-hand side, you've got the forward tubes. And then you've got, just above it, these various levers. So you've got own course and speed, off, and own course. So that tells the system what variables you're putting in. Aft torpedo gyro angle. So you've got forward torpedo gyro angle and the power switch, which turns on and off various elements of the system. You've got the fuses, of course. Now moving over to the central plate, these two bits at the top, you've got the illumination and power supply. So obviously if the ship's, this is mostly black with a little bit of white on it. So if the ship's running dark, you might not be able to necessarily see what's there. So you might need a bit of a light. Now, what you have here is putting in range and bearing to the targets. So you have these two dials are for optical bearing, so that'd be using the periscope or potentially someone up on top who might be communicating down to this position. And the reason you've got two dials is the dial on the left is working in tens of degrees. So it's currently set to just a little bit over 350 degrees, but that's 35. And then on the right, you have a dial that just goes from 1 to 10. So this will be like the minutes and seconds and hour hands on a clock. This will be spinning really quickly. This will be spinning somewhat more slowly, and this allows you to get a very precise reading. So this will tell you roughly where it is, and then So in this case, we're looking at, okay, it's just over 35, so a bit over 350 degrees, but do you really want to risk a quarter of an inch or less trying to determine which of those it is? But we look on here and we can see that actually that's 358 degrees. Now, next up, you've got radar bearing, because obviously the sub has radar. So the radar unit, which we saw earlier, is just over here behind us. And that has a similar scale in tens of degrees and then single-digit degrees. Range in yards. So again, you've got it in double digits and then single digits. So this one is a little bit more complex. So this one starts at 0 and goes all the way around to 70. And on this side, you've got 0 to 1,000. So you can try and work out all the differences for yourself. So, for example, at the moment, it's set to 63 and 0, so that would be 6,300 yards.
We're going to miss.
Yeah. And then you have the sound bearing, which is obviously using your sonar, whether you're using active or what we would today call passive sonar, hydrophones, and that is, again, obviously because it's a bearing rather than a range, it goes around 0 to 30. Well, 35 is the highest mark, obviously goes down technically to 36 with 0 to 10 there. And then below there, you've got your various inputs. So at the moment, optical is set to off. So we're telling the system we're not using any optical sighting. So you might be doing this purely from sonar at depth. Radar is currently set to off. So again, assuming that we are under the surface, you're not going to be using the radar systems. And then you've got sonar, and obviously at the moment the whole system is off, so that's also set to off. But if we were, let's say, running at 50 feet down and we just wanted to go off a sonar bearing, then we can switch this. So we've got number 1 receiver, number 2 receiver, or there's also receive and transmit. The radar station has 2 radars and a sonar setting, and optical, you've got 2 different inputs from the bridge and 2 different inputs from the periscope, because you have 2 periscopes at the moment. So on the left, we have our position keeper. So this is the main section that's going to tell you the fine detail data and also the special feature of the TDC. So starting up at the top left, we've got a dial where you can input the target speed. Rather optimistically, it goes up to 40 knots. Then there's a dial showing the range. There's a light showing generating, which of course eventually will give you a correct solution on the right. You've got target course, and then we're going to leave that one. Then we've got relative target bearing, because of course there's an absolute bearing and the relative bearing to your own ship. You've got your own course, and that is split again into a 0 to 35 dial with tens on the right. You've got your own speed, which obviously can be measured straight off of how fast your propellers are rotating. Another interesting one you've got is target length. Target length is important because that's going to determine, for example, how far you put your spread. If you're shooting at something like a Yamato, a really long ship, you can afford to have your spread out considerably further, whereas if you're shooting a fast-moving destroyer or a sub-chaser, a wide spread suitable for taking out a capital ship like a battleship or a carrier might completely miss a destroyer, it might thread between them. And then that all loops back into these 2. So you've got this top dial, which is showing what the computer now thinks the target ship is doing in terms of direction. And then your own ship. Now, obviously, everyone calls subs boats, but it specifically says ships. So that's what we're reading off the dial. Don't yell at me. And what this will tell you is what your sub is doing relative to the target. So at the moment, the way it's set up, we can see that the Cod is actually heading mostly away from the target, and the target is heading, roughly perpendicular to Cod's course. Now you can see there are 2 sets of arrows. The solid arrow shows where the system thinks the bow torpedoes are going to be going relative to the ship, and the broken arrow is where the aft torpedoes are going to be going relative to the ship. Now, obviously, on your own ship, that tells you where the torpedoes are going to be heading away from you. On the target ship, that's where the system thinks the torpedoes are going to be arriving at the ship. And of course, you can see your targets marked S&P, port and starboard. So at the moment, the system is off, so none of these readings are valid. But if they were valid, then this solution up top would be telling us that if we fired our forward tubes, it thinks that the torpedoes are going to arrive coming in from just aft of the ship, hitting on the port side, and considerably further aft on the ship, hitting on the starboard side. But once we get this all up and running, it'll generate an actual valid solution rather than just wherever it's left at the moment. And down here at the bottom, you've got the various dials and cranks, and that's what allows you to set all these values if they're not being automatically input anyway. And we've already seen on the periscope, you've got the pickle. So for example, if you were going to use optical bearing, that would set the optical bearing rather than having to manually input it. But you can, of course, change it. Now, the last thing, the secret feature, which puts the TDC above and beyond pretty much everything else in World War II, because you may have seen handheld calculation wheels that the U-boats used. There's various automated and handheld systems the Royal Navy uses, but all of those will tell you, what your firing solution is for a specific moment in time. So you feed it all the values as best you know them at that moment, and it gives you a solution. Now you can go off that solution, and if it's good, great, you might hit. If it's not good, then, well, the first thing you're going to know is when you miss and you've expended some very expensive torpedoes. This dial here, the time dial, is not because this is a time machine for sending the ship back and forth in the future, but it can think the ship back and forward in the future. So if the time is set to 0, great, fantastic. So that's giving you, this is your solution right now. However, because you've got all these inputs, you don't necessarily know if all these inputs are correct. For example, target speed is generally going to be your best estimate. So what you can do with all of this is you can then set the time dial, let's say 5 minutes in the future. If you set the time dial 5 minutes in the future, a TDC can then work out what the firing solution will be 5 minutes in the future. So assuming everything else is accurate, it will then say, okay, well, if you were to fire with your relative position to the target now, perhaps you want to fire the torpedoes with a 10-degree starboard offset. Okay, fine. But if you were going to fire 5 minutes in the future, based on what you think the target speed is at the moment, then you might need to fire 15 degrees off to starboard. And of course, it'll be reading that based on your estimate of target speed. So if your chaps on the bridge or with the periscopes have gone, well, I reckon this ship's going 10 knots, relatively typical for a slower ship in a Japanese convoy, what you can do is say, okay, well, we can see the ship now, we can see where it is, let's run it forward 5 minutes, and then the system will say, well, in 5 minutes time, the ship should now be on this bearing. So then you can sit there and go, okay, well, let's wait 5 minutes because they haven't spotted us. And in 5 minutes time, you pop your periscope up again at the bearing that the TDC has said to look. And if you pop the periscope up and the ship's dead set in your crosshairs, that means you've got the speed estimate correct. So you can now go, well, 1, we were correct, fantastic. 2, this thing's already got a firing solution for us. Let's get torpedoes in the water. If, however, you pop the periscope up and the ship is nowhere to be seen and you pan around, if the ship's further along than you think it should be, then that means it was going faster than you thought it was. And if it's not quite reached that bearing, then obviously it was going slower than you thought it was. And then, of course, because you know the difference in the bearings and the time, and you know what you thought the speed is, you can take the difference and work out what its actual speed is, at which point the TDC will then give you a new firing solution. And you can either then fire based on that if you want, perhaps if the enemy are getting a bit twitchy, some of the escorts are getting too close, or you can pop the periscope down again, wait another arbitrary amount of time, however forward you want to set the TDC, and check again. And if, again, then if the value is correct, fantastic, you can fire, and if it's not, then you can revise and revise and revise. As long as you're not detected, the TDC gives you the opportunity to put in all your data, but then also check that data against its own calculations and continue to refine it, which will give you progressively more and more accurate solutions. So over here, just to the right of the TDC, which is mounted on the port side of the control room, this is where you actually fire the torpedoes. So as you can see, you've got spindles engaged. Now we saw in the torpedo tube, these are the spindles that actually input the various settings to the torpedo. And then once the values calculated by the TDC have been transmitted to the torpedo and everything is confirmed, the torpedo is set, Then this light comes on, ready to fire. Now, of course, ready to fire will also depend on a few other things, like is the torpedo door closed and things like that. Pointers matched, so once all the lights are on relative for the tube, so in this case this is the aft tube, this is for the forward tubes, so these two lights are irrelevant there on the aft tubes, but on, let's say, if you wanted to fire tube 8, you'd want 1, 2, 3 lights on. Then you can set the thing to standby, and then you can hit the big red button to fire the torpedo. And of course everyone has to actually report what's going on. So it's not just a case of, oh, well, I think I'm going to fire a torpedo, let's press the button. You would have someone actually calling out, and then someone would be responding from the torpedo room to confirm that the torpedo has been fired, because there could be a few things that could happen. The torpedo could fire the way you actually want it to do. The torpedo might have a delay, in which case, if, let's say the automatic firing system hasn't worked properly and someone has to use the manual system. So if they have to use the manual system, and this obviously now isn't working, or perhaps that particular shot for whatever reason isn't working, that's obviously going to introduce a new time delay, which means everything has to be updated. But one of the things that's really good about the TDC, it's not quite as groundbreaking as that ability to look forward and backwards in time, but with a TDC, it's also automatically inputting the corrections as time goes on. So unlike a fixed solution where you have to fire at a specific time or else you're stuffed, with this, if you, let's say, decide, actually, I don't want to engage just this moment, maybe someone says, okay, look, we're ready to fire with 5 tubes, but tube 6 is being a bit sticky, and you've got something really important, like, say, a carrier in your sights, you don't have to fire right now. You can just go, okay, that's fine. We're just going to adjust course 10 degrees to starboard and give you another 30 seconds to get the tube 6 ready. Now, all of those changes automatically get fed back into the TDC. The TDC will continue to generate new solutions and send those solutions to the torpedoes. So 30 seconds later, when tube 6 is ready, you don't have to wait for the TDC to compute a whole new set of data. It's just been doing that in the background, and it's immediately ready to go, and you can start ripple firing off torpedoes. Now, one thing that you sometimes see in movies, and actually this is something that movies generally don't get wrong, but occasionally they do, is that you're not going to flip every single switch, hit the button, and off go 6 torpedoes at once. What you're going to be doing is firing each torpedo one at a time. That doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be slow, kind of like a semi-automatic rifle. If you can pull the trigger really fast, it's almost indistinguishable from some forms of automatic fire. So if you want a nice big spread of 6 torpedoes to go off, you can get 6 torpedoes out of this sub pretty darn quickly, but it's not simultaneous. Now, there's a few different reasons for that, but that's something we can go into elsewhere.
Then progressing out of the conning tower and through the control room, we come to this aft section of the control room, and this is the radio shack, if you like. Very, very confined space. You can see there's a little seat there, gives you some idea how narrow this is. This is how the sub communicates with the outside world and how messages are encrypted and decrypted. The machine is actually just to the lower left of this photo. And again, starts out as a not particularly large space, but somewhat larger than this, but gradually filled in with more cryptography equipment and radio equipment in general as the war goes on. And then stepping through the bulkhead, you have the main galley. There is a smaller officer's galley right up front, but this is the main galley where food would be prepared for most of the crew. And yes, there is an ice cream machine. This is what an ice cream machine for a submarine like Cod looks like in the Second World War. Big grey box, and as you can see, there's a bunch of chains nearby, because ultimately, early in the war, submarines weren't issued with ice cream machines, so they occasionally had to creatively acquire them from larger ships. And once they had them, either through interesting acquisitions or through later on being issued them, they were going to make sure no one else was going to purloin them from their sub. So very, very well secured. Probably one of the most secure bits of equipment on the entire ship, in actual fact. And then, as we go still further aft, we come to the primary berthing for the crew, but if you are on a tour of the sub, here is where you'll find a replica of one of the ship's batteries. And as you can see, this is a pretty chunky old thing. It's the height of 2 and a bit bunks, and this is your basic lead-acid battery. Not especially powerful by modern standards, but it was pretty much the best they could come up with at the time, and there would be several hundred of these providing the electrical power for the ship's motors. This was one of the main features that was updated during the Guppy program. Cod, of course, didn't undergo that upgrade, but various others in her class did, because one of the major changes that was made during that program was to turn the subs from primarily surface-based vessels that went underwater to conceal themselves and attack the enemy to primarily underwater-based vessels that would only come up to the surface for occasional cruising and recharging of said batteries, and as well as reshaping the outer hull to make it more streamlined, they had brand new batteries which were far more power dense, and they replaced ones like the one that you can see here. And then continuing aft, there is a little workshop tucked in amongst the machinery spaces. And yes, this is a relatively decent sized lathe, so in the event that something broke, Cod does actually have the capability to repair herself to a limited degree. Even if you don't have the particular spare part, you can make a spare part. And that's understandably quite useful to have if the alternative is drifting several thousand miles away from the nearest friendly port. And then at the other end of the engine room, and if you're wondering why we didn't see the rest of the machinery itself, well, we have seen a few other sub-machineries on this channel, and also, again, go and see Cod for yourself, and then you can see even more of it. But here is quite a useful plate. As you can see, it not only tells you for your various speeds, 1/3, 2/3, standard and full, what your RPM needs to be and what speed that will actually result in. As you can see, it also tabulates it by how many generators or engines you're running, and you can see the second section is for 2 or running off the battery, this being for surface running, obviously. And just adjacent to it, you can see a much more complicated set of tabling. So, for example, the grid on the top, that tells you voltage per cell, because obviously you have multiple cells making up a battery, and then along the bottom you have the temperature in degrees Fahrenheit, and as you can see the note there, it says reduce your charging current to the next step whenever the voltage-temperature point on this curve is reached, because the last thing you want to do if you've got an open-top lead-acid battery is overheat the thing. So this is a very useful thing to know when you're trying to recharge batteries, especially given that in wartime conditions you probably want to recharge them as fast as is safe. And then just below that you can see there's a table more generally for knots versus RPM when you're on the surface. So for example, at 5 knots you're doing 64 RPM. If you're doing the full flank speed of a fleet submarine of 21 knots, that's 286 RPM. And next to it is a handy little reference chart for when you are submerged. So you can see there 40 RPM will, at dead slow, will give you 2 knots. Increasing that by 10 will give you 1/3 ahead, which is 2.4 knots. Your standard ahead is 120 RPM, which will give you 6.2 knots. Full, 160 RPM for 8.2 knots. And if you're absolutely hammering it, you can put in 200 RPM, which will give you 10 knots. And it's interesting because you can compare that against the table next to it and see that, roughly speaking, 200 RPM on the surface will give you just over 15 knots. So it gives you some idea of the extra drag caused by being fully submerged. And there's also a handy RPM chart for backing up. But you can also find plenty of stuff above decks. There's this little signal light, which you can see the louvres still work on. And there's a bunch of deck guns, because of course US submarines at the time didn't just use their torpedoes to deal with their opponents. You have a variety of weapons which you can use on the surface as well. So here you can see we have one of the ship's anti-aircraft guns, and as well as obviously being very useful against potential attacking aircraft while you're on the surface recharging and so forth, it's also useful against smaller Japanese craft if you don't want to waste an expensive torpedo, and these would be used with a great deal of effectiveness against such small Japanese trawlers and coastal craft in the closing stages of the war. But of course you've also got the main deck gun, so this would be used against more general surface craft, again mostly unarmed ones, or for shore bombardment missions, again later on in the war. You could also, in theory, use this against aircraft, but you're better off using the automatic cannon that we looked at earlier in that respect, because this is somewhat harder to train, and while this kind of caliber of gun can be found on US surface ships in an anti-air role, the fact is, aboard COD, it is a purely manual weapon. There's no power assist whatsoever, and obviously if you're aboard a submarine, the submarine is going to pitch and roll far more severely on the surface than the average surface ship, so with the best will in the world, your accuracy with this thing in an anti-air role, and just the one, is going to be relatively poor. You can use it if you want, but I'd probably stick with the automatic cannon instead. And the other fun thing about this particular gun aboard COD is that they have set it up to be able to do simulated firing. And yeah, that is actually pretty darn loud, even though they're using gas as opposed to, actual propellant, because, well, for better or worse, the other ships in port tend to take a dim view of you lobbing actual shells at various other moored ships. I suspect the local airport would probably have an objection as well, considering that they fly quite nearby. The flight path is in fact just off to the ship's starboard, which is why I don't have any drone footage myself, because, well, despite the fact that the COD is kind of bounded by buildings, and I did write a very nice letter to the FAA saying, look, can I please get a permit, because I'm flying actually slightly off the flight path of the airport, and I'm going to keep the drone well below the line of the trees and the line of the buildings, at which point it's not going to get hit by an aircraft, because if an aircraft does hit my drone, then the aircraft has already gone straight through a large building, at which point it probably has more important things to worry about. But the FAA, well, or at least the person that I was communicating with, has a complete sense of humour failure and just gave me a short, sharp, curt, and actually, frankly, quite rude notice that basically said, don't even dare think about it. So, wasn't able to use my drone, but fortunately, a very kind gentleman who was able to get a permit, presumably from a slightly more sane and sensible FAA person a few years ago, donated, well, this overhead shot and the drone footage that you saw at the beginning of this little documentary, although there is a little bit more of that as well available. And so that wraps up a highlight of our visit to USS Cod. There is actually quite a bit more that I took aboard USS Cod in terms of looking at various bits and pieces, the machinery spaces, the access hatches, the area under the coaming, the battle damage that she still has up front. So I can do a follow-up video looking in more detail at some of those rather interesting features. If you'd like, let me know in the comments below. And if you'd like to see the Torpedo Data Computer actually running and generating a solution in real time, then hop over to my Patreon, link in the video description below, where I've made it available for free. You don't worry, you don't need to sign up. I mean, if you want to, that's great, but you don't need to. It's just a nice place to host that separate from this main video. And of course, final shout out to Paul, the wonderful curator of USS Cod, who you may have seen occasionally popping into some of the live sections that we filmed, and the rest of Cod's crew, who made me extremely welcome on my visit, and of course to all the rest of you. Well, most of the rest of you seen here, but all of you guys who showed up to say hi over there when I did this particular visit to USS Cod. Thanks very much for coming. It made it very, very enjoyable, and I'm sure the guys aboard Cod appreciated the extra revenue from ticket sales and so forth as well. So if you'd like to see USS Cod for yourself, she is of course available to see in Cleveland, Ohio. Again, link to her website in the video description below as well. You can work out opening times and plan your visit out fairly well. There is some car parking quite nearby, so you don't have to worry too much about that. Absolutely, definitely worth a visit. I know I'll definitely be heading back if I find myself in that part of the US again. And thanks everyone for watching. See you again in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.